Okay, perfect. So the majority of this workshop's actually going to be focused around receiving feedback versus giving feedback. So in terms of some of the things that we'll discuss over the course of the next 75 minutes or so, we'll discuss starting off with about me, just hopefully shedding a little bit of credibility to my role, what I do, as well as the topic. We'll then unpack what feedback is. We'll then also decipher why feedback matters. Finally, finally, we'll discuss the feedback struggle. And then we'll also talk about making feedback work for you and how you can effectively leverage feedback by cultivating a positive feedback environment in order to enhance your career and propel you forward. So I guess I'll start with introducing who I am. So one of my really great friends actually suggested that I always try and introduce myself by not actually including what I do in terms of my job title, but instead discussing things that I love or things that I'm passionate about or purposes or values that align to who I am. So my name's Andrew Odong. I'm a lover of beanie hats. I wear beanie hats wherever I go, even if it's like the sweltering heat, you'll still catch me in a beanie hat. I like to think of myself as a gift master. So I love gifts. I think that they're the most incredible form of communication in the 21st century. So you'll see a number of gifts throughout this workshop. I'm always looking to add to my collection. So if you have any gifts that you want to send across, feel free. I'm always building up my library of gifts. And I also like to think of myself as a community connoisseur. This is a bit of a corny strapline that I've given myself. I had a conversation with my boyfriend actually saying, I'm thinking about adding community connoisseur to my LinkedIn strapline. He's like, yeah, no, don't do it. But I went and did it anyway. So he's probably a bit annoyed about that. I have 7 years experience in amplifying underrepresented voices through brand partnerships. So that's really been, I guess, the main theme that has definitely started to surface throughout my career more recently. And in terms of my day job, I'm a program manager at Facebook where I lead partnerships and programs designed to enhance brand sentiment and attract diverse talent in support of our pipelines across EMEA. So that's a little bit about me. Hopefully that adds a bit of credibility to my perspectives on this topic, and definitely really excited to be here today with you all. Okay. So next, I just wanted to give a quick glance on my career timeline. This will become more, I guess you'll realize why this is important in the next few slides. But in 2014, I graduated in astrophysics from the University of Leicester. Yes, you read that correctly. I am a physicist. Well, used to be, I don't know about now. And you may be wondering why I don't work as an engineer or an astronaut. Essentially, pressure from my parents, I'm sure many of you can perhaps connect with that, meant that I looked at pursuing a very hardcore academic degree, according to my dad, which landed me in this degree that I took in 2014 and graduated, but quickly realized that this wasn't something I wanted to pursue more long-term. In 2015, I became a conference producer. I don't know whether any of you are familiar with Milk Round or if that's still a thing. It's essentially kind of a jobs board for graduate programs. Maybe I'm showing my age, but I came across the title of a conference producer and was really interested in what the role of a conference producer was. So essentially, we're those people who write agendas, invite speakers, and make sure that the conference makes money. So that was my role shortly after university. Really was able to leverage my research skills, being a physicist, my ability to understand complex topics and really apply that to building world-class conferences and event summits. In 2018, so 3 years later, after building C-suite conferences, I decided to stop being a conference producer. Yeah, it really wasn't for me long-term, but what I realized was a lot of the conversations that I was championing within the conference format weren't necessarily topics that were aligned to my values as a person, and really were disconnected with my personal values. So instead, I went freelance, almost went broke as a result, founded a virgin startup called Pessa Productions, and essentially was wearing multiple hats, really just trying to keep the lights on, but I was really working in a way that was aligned more to my purpose. So in my year of being freelance, I was working with grassroots organizations, and organizations focus on amplifying underrepresented voices. Just to give you an example of some of the projects I worked on, I worked with the British Film Institute to help shed light on queer people of color in filmmaking and really start to develop programs that help accelerate professional development for filmmakers from minority groups. I also worked with Spotify to amplify women in podcasting and their voices by developing the first UK's Women in Podcasting Festival. And while doing that work, I think I probably had about 15 pounds to my name by the end of it. I actually got the call from Facebook to join in this brand new role. I was actually headhunted through a recruitment agency who was really interested in my experience, working with grassroots communities, building relationships with brands, and was invited to do that in-house at Facebook and really developing those relationships with grassroots organizations, but within the organizations such as Facebook. Of course, I didn't turn down that opportunity. It was incredible, the opportunity to have a footprint at such a large organization and really give back to communities and work within a role that was very much aligned with my values. Okay, so before we go ahead, actually, this is going to be my first exercise asking you all for feedback. So I would love to know if there are any observations that you have around my career timeline. And hopefully you didn't see the next slide, which kind of gives away the answer. But I don't know whether there are any observations you have of this career timeline. I'll just pause there. Anything that jumps out? Someone said Cardi B. So you did see the next slide. Okay, let me go on to the next slide. So you may or may not have noticed that I had never been promoted. So throughout my 7 years as a working professional, I had never ever been promoted. The way I was able to progress throughout my career was essentially jumping ship. So moving to a more senior role at a different organization, but I never really came face to face with the fact that I had never progressed within a specific role. Two of the reasons that I guess alone to this reality was the fact that I lacked intention and I didn't have any specific goals. I thought that if I kept my head down and worked hard without being honest about what I wanted and expressing this to my peers and line managers, this really had an impact on my ability to progress. And that was something I realized actually quite recently in the last couple of years, was being open and talking about what I wanted. Because as soon as you voice what it is that you really want, you, I guess, open up doors for you to receive those blessings and those promotions or whatever it is that you're looking for. If you're not open about what you want, then people essentially can't read your mind and won't be able to really guide you and help nurture some of those goals that you have for yourself. I also did not understand the true power of feedback. So feedback was mainly disguised as advice. Perhaps there was good reason for that, as I was slightly more junior in my career. So advice was needed for me to grow from learning from those who perhaps had more experience than me. I would get defensive and I had misperceptions around how feedback as a tool could be used to enhance my career. So as a result, I wasn't promoted throughout those 7 years. But I will go on to the next slide. So let's start with unpacking what feedback is. So anyone want to go ahead and share perhaps what their definition of feedback is? It can either be in the chat or you can unmute yourself or raise your hand and feel free to kind of share what your opinion is. So I can see Liddell said information given back about yourself. Yep. Highlighting what was good and what is bad from Jasper. Also suggestions for improvement. Yep. Okay, I will move on. So whenever I do these sorts of workshops, I always try and understand how the Oxford English Dictionary or the Cambridge Dictionary defines the term, and sort of use that as a bit of an anchor point, but then also look to develop our own definitions or unique understandings about these words. So the Oxford English Dictionary defines feedback as information about reactions to a product, a person's performance of a task, which is used as a basis for improvement. So Jasper and Liddell definitely were on the money in terms of the Oxford Dictionary and how they define feedback. I also found quite an interesting definition of feedback from Creighton University. I don't know if anyone knows what Creighton University or where it's based. I don't know, but I found this term very interesting. So feedback is not advice, praise, or evaluation, which I think are some terms that we perhaps have synonymously or associate with feedback. Feedback is information about how one is doing in an effort to reach a goal. So we're going to unpack this statement and this definition of feedback a little bit more in the next few slides. So in terms of types of feedback, I think I saw someone mention, what sort of feedback do you mean? I believe that was a comment from Liddell. So feedback can really come in many different forms. So we can have structured feedback. Examples include performance reviews, team meetings, survey responses. Data and analytics is a really clear kind of marker for feedback, especially if you're looking at consumer behavior or how consumers are responding to your products or services. Key performance indicators as well are an example of structured feedback, as well as formal one-to-ones that you have with your managers or your peers, as well as company all-hands meetings. Unstructured feedback, so this is informal peer praise, those water cooler conversations or hallway conversations, conversational feedback that you have on the day-to-day, and then also ad hoc manager check-ins as well. These are great examples of feedback. But as mentioned, we're also going to revisit that previous slide and look at how feedback is unpacked in relation to Creighton University and why that is important. So if we unpack this sentence, we see that feedback is not advice, praise, or evaluation. So I think this is a really key that this distinction is made. Although feedback and advice have a lot in common, giving advice can be helpful when someone is perhaps slightly more junior in the role, when a request is quite urgent, or when the needs are very high. So there needs to be kind of minimal error made. But usually feedback is usually better because it actually allows for more commitment from that individual to make a change and allows them to come to their own conclusions, which usually has a greater impact long term. I came across this really cool lyric from Kanye West where he essentially said, "Now let's make this clear so y'all see, I don't take advice from people less successful than me." So I think that really speaks to the importance of why we need to distinguish feedback from advice, especially when that advice is unsolicited. So studies from the American Psychological Association have actually shown that we tend not to detach feedback from the person. So if you don't feel like feedback is coming from a credible source or a trustful source, you will essentially discard that feedback and have a pretty negative reaction, or won't take that feedback on board, similar to what Kanye West has done here. I think that this was from, I don't know, one of his last albums. I know what the song is, No Mistakes. But hence why it's important to make this distinction when thinking about your own reactions to feedback and the person who's delivering that feedback. So let's delve a little bit further into the difference between advice and feedback. So feedback is defined as someone observes something that you may not be aware of. They bring it to your attention. They share their perspective on why it matters, and then you decide what to do with it. And then I think with that, we can clearly see the difference between feedback and advice, where for advice, someone observes something they believe you can improve upon, and they tell you what to do instead. So clearly there's that very much that distinction between advice and feedback, whereas advice can lead to more compliance. It may not necessarily lead to learning or self-development in the long term. Okay, great. So now let us unpack the second part of that statement. So feedback is information about how one is doing in an effort to reach a goal. Now, this actually ties back to the story that I mentioned at the beginning about not being promoted and not having specific goals. Feedback is even more impactful when you tie specific feedback to specific outcomes. Obviously, when we think about goals, some of the frameworks that we can think about are the SMART goals framework. So how are you thinking about specific goals that are measurable, that are accountable, that are goals that are relevant as well and realistic, and then goals that are timely. So I definitely would encourage you to think about what are your SMART goals, what are your objectives, and then how can your feedback actually support you in achieving those goals. It's all well and good having specific feedback, but if you don't have any frame of reference, that can really hinder the development that you have both professionally and personally. So I found this really cool diagram, which is actually from the Journal of Applied Psychology, around feedback and goal setting and how they're intrinsically connected. So how improving performance requires both specific goals and specific feedback. So as you'll see here, when you have specific goals and specific feedback, that's really kind of the optimum space that you want to be in, where feedback is easily understood and applied to future performance. When your goals are general and your feedback is specific, performance evaluation is difficult because you don't really have a frame of reference in terms of what you're trying to achieve. When you have specific goals and general feedback, feedback is interpreted in terms of the performer's frame of reference. And then if you have general feedback and general goals, feedback is difficult to interpret and apply. So we are using a lot of references throughout this workshop. I really want to make sure that what we're discussing today is backed up by research where possible and by real kind of tangible references that you can take away and apply to your own careers. So next slide. So when I was able to actually combine specific feedback and specific goals, I was actually able to secure my first ever promotion. So this actually happened last week, I think. So I had my fingers crossed. I was like, I need to get this promotion before this workshop so that I could really show the impact of these principles that I'm sharing and how you can truly apply them in a way that actually makes sense for you. So I got my 10s across the board. I got my flowers finally, and I was able to get promoted. So all of these lessons work, and I really hope that you're able to apply them to your own career goals. I always also like to say that I don't like to give too much advice, but I do like to share, I guess, my experiences and knowledge that I've come across. And throughout this workshop, please do take this information, filter it through your own reality, make your own observations, and really see how you can apply those learnings in a way that makes sense to you, because only you understand yourself and only you understand your environment. So I just want to caveat this information before we really get into the meat of the workshop. So I will pause there for any questions before we start to discuss why feedback matters.
Hi, Andrew. I actually typed in a question. I thought maybe you can maybe shed some light. So my question was, can you give a feedback and then give an advice? So can they coexist?
Yeah, absolutely. I think feedback opens up space for the person receiving the feedback to come to their own conclusions, whereas advice is, I guess, more prescriptive in terms of you actually advising what are the best next steps for the person receiving that feedback. So I definitely think they can coexist. I think it depends on your environment. It depends on your relationship. As mentioned, feedback from a trustful source. Also, what is the context? Like, are you coming to the conversation with more knowledge, more experience? Have you And I think it's really a number of factors that really impact the best approach to take. But they're definitely both valuable. But I think it depends on the nature of the relationship. What are your goals? And what is the long-term impact you want to impart through that conversation?
Thanks. Just off the back of that, would you say that when we talk about feedback, does it really matter where the source comes, like where the feedback comes from, or who you're getting feedback from comes from, in comparison to, say, you're getting advice? Do you feel like in advice you're more sort of likely to sort of like feel a little bit more, I'm not going to listen to that, or I'm going to listen to that because of the source?
Yes, so I think psychologically the source of feedback does matter, and studies have shown that the source has to be perceived as credible by the person receiving the feedback. But I think there are ways to work around that. So it comes back to the way you deliver the feedback as well. Are you asking for their feedback on your feedback? So for instance, are you following up with the question, asking what are their thoughts on your observations? I think that's really important. So I definitely think with advice, perhaps the stakes are slightly higher because you are prescribing next steps to that individual. So perhaps you need to either be more credible in your relationship or have that kind of strong foundation. But definitely, I think you can overcome some of those barriers from a source perspective as a person who's giving feedback by ensuring that you are opening up space for them to really clarify any kind of questions that they have around the feedback that you've given.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Let me see if there are any other questions. Do you believe it's important? So this is a question from Gigi. Do you believe it's important to gather feedback for situations or things that may not be job specific or a hobby or goal oriented? Yeah, absolutely. Feedback is not only something that can be applied to your professional career, it can definitely be applied for any endeavors, whether it be relationships, relationships with family, relationships with friends. Of course, the frame of reference for this workshop is, of course, looking at your career, but I definitely think feedback is such an important part of life. I even came across an article that talked about the importance of feedback in biological systems and how it's allowed for evolution of organisms, as they have seen how they kind of how certain things, how the environment reacts to certain ways in which they operate or the ways in which they move through nature. So that isn't allowed for evolution to carry its course the way it has. So yeah, it's scientific, it's social, it's personal, it's professional. Feedback is really all encompassing. But I won't go into too much of that, of course, for the purpose of this workshop. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. Okay, great. So now let us delve a little bit deeper into why feedback matters. We'll look at this through, and also the benefits of feedback. So as mentioned in the first section, we talked about how feedback can help drive self-awareness. And really self-awareness is one of the core areas of self-development. If you're not aware of how you're perceived, your values, your abilities, your strengths and your weaknesses, you really won't be able to have a strong foundation in order to understand where you want to get to and how you want to develop. Feedback is really a great way for us to understand our perceptions amongst our peers, and that awareness can really help drive personal development. So I think this is kind of like the anchor statement around why feedback is important, and we'll go and delve a little bit deeper into some of the other benefits of feedback in this workshop. So I did say I'd reference Carol in this workshop, and I'm so happy that I was able to get this in. Excuse the really messy scribble that I did over the first sentence, but yes. So Carol actually dropped a great comment on LinkedIn where he said, "This is such an important topic for career success. It takes humility to seek feedback. With a growth mindset, it will make you better. With a finite mindset, it will make you bitter." And I thought that this quote was really, really great and really speaks to the importance of feedback. how it can also foster a growth mindset and also greater awareness about you as a person and how you're perceived. Okay, so here, this slide speaks to some of the benefits of feedback. So I've tried to bucket this into 5 different pillars. So feedback helps us grow. So feedback is a way for us to enhance self-awareness, which I spoke to earlier, leading to better performance, us making better decisions, and then also making more informed decisions. Feedback also gives us insight into how others perceive us or may experience us and our behaviors. So it's really critical to building trusting relationships with those around you. Feedback also allows us to have a stronger sense of purpose because it essentially sheds light on how we're providing tangible impact on those around us. And then it also helps to boost morale. Positive feedback can reinforce a job well done and motivate us to continue to do that work in the way that we have been doing or improve upon ways of working. And then it also is a really great way for us to learn from others, learn from their experiences, and then also apply those learnings to our own efforts. Before I go ahead, are there any other benefits that anyone wants to draw attention to as it relates to feedback, or any comments on the above? Okay, great. Let me move on to the next one. Okay, so here are some stats I came across as it relates to feedback and how it's perceived currently in the workplace. So only 26% of employees strongly agree that the feedback they receive helps them do better. Also found out that only 17% of millennials report receiving meaningful feedback. Again, this was a report by Gallup in 2019. And then 60% of Gen Z want multiple check-ins from their managers during the week. Of those, 40% want the interaction with their boss to be daily or several times each day. So it's clear that there's a very much an appetite for meaningful feedback in the workplace. But then what these statistics also highlight is the fact that there's still a long way to go for us to really get to a place where we feel like our employees are really embracing feedback and feeling like they are receiving meaningful feedback on a day-to-day. I don't know why all these stats are in 2019 as well. I tried to find more recent stats, but clearly 2019 was a very interesting year for feedback. So with all of these stats in mind, why is receiving effective feedback such a struggle, or why does it feel like such a struggle? So in the next few slides, we're actually going to unpack the psychological, cultural, and societal reasons why feedback or receiving feedback is such a struggle. But before we do so, just want to pause there to see if you have any questions on the benefits of feedback and why feedback matters. I see Gigi mentioned, I wonder if it's because so many people lost jobs last year. Yeah, definitely. I think it was a very difficult time. And of course, getting feedback and trying to leverage that feedback to understand their situation, perhaps was the reason why there was so much research done into that space. Any other comments, or anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask any questions around the benefits of feedback or make any comments about that? I'm operating 2 screens today, so I'm literally like trying to manage both screens. But I see Liddell mention I'm scribbling away. Sorry, that's fine. Okay, great. I'm going to move forward. We will have time for more questions throughout the session. So I found this really interesting quote from Dr. Sheila Heen, who's an author and lecturer at Harvard Law School. And she essentially said receiving feedback can feel like a gift and a colonoscopy. If you don't know what a colonoscopy is, Google is your friend, but I wouldn't recommend heading to the images section. But I think this speaks to the fact that feedback can feel quite intrusive and not particularly pleasant. The fact that she's a doctor at Harvard Law School, a pretty credible source of truth there. So I just found this quote quite funny and quite interesting, interesting metaphor. So I did tell you I was going to come through with the gifts. So here's your first dose of my gift game. Firstly, the reason why feedback can seem like quite a struggle is because, quite simply put, feedback is stressful. So I'm about to get quite neuroscientific. But as you know, we evolved from our more primal days, but humans in nature, we're quite social creatures. And we also tend to, well, we used to, and still to this day, operate in communities and social groups, in tribes, and really in the primal, I'm trying to think of the word, but essentially for you to be excluded from social settings or groups or tribes, it really meant that your survival essentially depended on being involved in a community. So we still take some of those primal, I guess, mindsets into the modern day. So exclusion still triggers threat responses within humans, and feedback is akin to triggering some of those threat responses. So this includes anxiety, stress, your heart rate increasing. These are some of the physical conditions that manifest themselves when presented with feedback. And there's been many studies that have shown the impact of feedback on your kind of stress levels and how this triggers your fight or flight response. So this is one of the reasons from a psychological perspective why feedback can be such a struggle. From a cultural perspective, we also have the challenge of positive feedback bias in the workplace. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, where your colleagues, your peers, and your friends, even yourself, you may be conforming to a culture of niceness in the workplace. I know that this is something that is incredibly British as well. So thinking about culturally, where you sit within your workplace as well can have an impact on positive feedback bias in the workplace. So despite those around you perhaps wanting to speak and act more candidly, instead, or even more critically of the work that is being done, instead they're conforming to this culture of niceness. And this is actually a psychological phenomena that is referenced as brittle smiles. So it's actually been diagnosed, and it's really interesting how that impacts the ability to have really meaningful critique in the workplace. Liddell said, I hate that, I know all the gifts. We probably exist in the same kind of den on Twitter. So yeah, that's where I get most of mine. And then the final reason why seeking feedback can be such a struggle. So we spoke to the psychological impact, we spoke to the social impact. Now we're speaking to the culture. We spoke to the cultural impact. Now we're speaking to disparities as it relates to minority groups as well. So many studies have been completed as it relates to gender bias, as it relates to feedback. So specifically men delivering feedback to women in the workplace, women are actually less likely to receive actionable feedback that will allow them to progress in their careers, whereas feedback between two same-sex managers as well as employees, specifically men within the workplace, more actionable feedback tends to be given in order to allow progression in the workplace. So numerous studies have been done to kind of prove the existence of a positive feedback bias as it relates to difference. And then also even across racial lines, I reference one of the studies that has actually taken place under the British Psychological Society, where they looked at the impact of white managers delivering feedback to Black employees and how that impacts the ability to deliver effective feedback. So that results in emotional discomfort amongst perhaps the more dominant majority groups in the workplace. And this actually leads to positive feedback bias, whereby you receive more praise as a minority professional in the workplace, as well as less criticism. And you tend to find that your feedback focuses on your qualities and your personality traits versus the work done. So it's really important for, especially if you come from an underrepresented group, to be mindful of that feedback bias, and to ensure that you're leaning in and ensuring that you're spotting and identifying those trends, and then being proactive in terms of really getting actionable feedback from your manager and reverse coaching them to really support you in your progression in the workplace. So I'm going to pause there for any questions before we start to really head into what you can do, what strategies you can employ, what tools you can employ to really make sure that feedback is less of a struggle for you and to really overcome some of those psychological, social, and cultural barriers to receiving career enhancing feedback. So let me just check the chat. So I see Liddell mentioned, if you have mental health issues, how does that affect getting effective feedback, if that makes sense? So I will be transparent. I'm not an expert as it relates to mental health issues, and especially in the workplace. From what I would say is that it's important that perhaps where you are comfortable, that those around you, I don't feel, if I'm being transparent, I don't feel like I have the knowledge to speak on that topic, because I think it really depends on how open you are with your mental health issues, perhaps with your line manager, and then being able to support and nurture you and really have that adapt the feedback that they're given to you. So I think it really depends on the knowledge that those around you have about your mental health issues, and then also the ability for them to also have the knowledge to be able to deliver feedback that is actionable to you, kind of given that understanding, if they know about it. Yes. Okay, great. I see I've got a question from Jasper. You mentioned that people are more likely to receive feedback from people more successful than oneself. How do you give feedback to your superior manager then? Yeah, great question. I think when you're looking at your career, you actually find, and my research that I did before this workshop actually showed that when you're perhaps more junior in your career, it's very easy to receive more advice than feedback. Then you get to a point when you're perhaps a middle manager or you're a senior member of staff, and you actually get quite effective feedback at that point. And that's when your career is really accelerating. You're at that inflection point. Then there gets a point where you start to get even more and more senior, and then it's harder for you to receive feedback because people are worried about the repercussions of giving that feedback to you. So I think it's really important that in terms of giving feedback to your superior or manager, we'll actually talk through those steps later on this presentation. But definitely it's important to create that environment first and make feedback a habit, given the conversations with your manager, and try and make that feedback more frequent. I think by making feedback more frequent in your interactions, you're able to kind of avoid any sort of surprises as it relates to how you're performing or how your relationship with one another is understood, and you're able to clear up any misconceptions as and when they come, versus waiting for your performance review or at your annual review with your manager to essentially share any feedback back and forth. I also think it's important that your organization creates processes that allow for you to deliver upward feedback. I think it can be a lot more difficult when you're not empowered to deliver upward feedback, or you're working in an organization that doesn't make this part of their processes. So I definitely think one-to-ones are the greatest environment for you to deliver upward feedback, as well as doing that as frequently as possible, creating that psychological safety between yourselves, asking for feedback for yourself as well, because I think when you're proactive about asking for feedback, you're likely to have that kind of yo-yo relationship with your manager, and you're creating that safe space for you both to kind of exchange how you're doing and align on expectations. But definitely it helps if your organization makes this a process as well.
I have one quick question. Thank you, Andrew, for the workshop.
Hiya.
Hi. So does the confidence you have in the relationship between like your manager and your colleague, does that influence the way you give your feedback? Sorry, you probably may have said it earlier on in the presentation. I wasn't here for.
Yeah, I definitely think it does. Confidence. I think it's important to have that foundation, but I think it's also important to set expectations straight away. I think it's harder to create those behaviors in a relationship that is perhaps very much well established and you've almost kind of formed your roles within that relationship. So I think it's important as soon as that you kick off your relationship with your manager, let them know what is important to you and let them know that you're open to feedback, and then also what expectations you have of your manager. But I do think that it's important to set those expectations up front, and also, again, regular touch points with your manager to kind of voice those concerns.
Thank you.
How are we doing on time as well? Just conscious of that. Okay, we're at 15:15, so okay, we're good on time. I think what we'll do is we'll take a quick 5-minute break and then we'll kick off again at 20 past. So if you want to grab a drink, have a toilet break, and then we'll get back into the workshop at 20 past. See you soon.
Quick question in the chat. Does anyone call you Beanie Man, Andrew? Since you have different colors of beanie for different occasions. I feel like I've seen you with 5 so far. But I'm sure you definitely have more than 5. You're mute.
Yes, no, I don't get called Beanie Man, but I can own that. I'm happy with that. I can take that as a nickname, a takeaway from this workshop. Let me share my screen again. I just realized I feel like I haven't used Zoom chat in a while because we don't have access to it at work. It's mainly just the video. And I just realized I was actually, instead of messaging everyone, I was messaging Jasper individually in the direct message. So yeah.
I just saw as well.
Yeah, so I was just responding to Liddell. I was like screaming, no, they don't, but I sent it to Jasper. But yeah, hi Jasper. Oh. Okay, great. We've got one more minute and then we'll get right into it. Okay, great. So let us get right into it. So next, I just wanted to discuss how to make feedback work for you. And I think this is, of course, what we primarily came to this workshop for, was what are the tools, what are the behaviors, what are the different strategies that you can employ to your career in order to make feedback work for you. So with this in mind and with those barriers in mind that we discussed earlier in the last section, how do you overcome these barriers in order to get effective feedback? So the number one strategy that you can use to get career enhancing feedback is really being proactive about it. Asking for feedback really is the best path for you to create psychological safety and create that mutual understanding with your line managers and those who influence the trajectory of your career, and essentially enable meaningful feedback. This has actually been demonstrated in many studies that show that the threat response, the heart rate, the anxiety is actually reduced when you proactively seek feedback versus almost, I guess, I don't want to use the term being a victim, but essentially waiting for feedback to come to you. You need to be proactive about this. So some of the ways in which you can do that are, so I've just had a pop-up come up. Okay, I'm back. Can everyone see my slides? Okay, great. So some of the ways that you can be proactive about seeking feedback is asking clarifying questions. So when you do have that initial discussion and you're seeking your feedback, focus your attention on understanding the feedback. What is truly being said? What is the body language? What is the verbiage? What is being discussed versus your emotions and how you may react? I think we've all certainly been in situations where you're so focused on how you're going to react and how you're feeling that you miss what is truly being said. So really in those moments, do ask any clarifying questions in order to understand the feedback so that you can act accordingly, or process the feedback in a way that is more accurate of this, an accurate reflection of the situation. I think I mentioned this earlier, increasing the frequency of feedback, so making it a habit so that it's less scary. As you increase the frequency of feedback asked, you'll get more comfortable asking for feedback, and your peers will also get more comfortable giving it because they see that you've opened up a welcome mat for feedback, and then you're able to have that mutual understanding and that mutual exchange. Some of the other ways that you can make feedback less stressful, sorry, I'm getting my tongue tied. And I do assure you that this is easier said than done, but it's definitely possible. So separating judgment from feedback. So keeping your composure, reminding yourself that feedback really isn't a judgment on you as a person or your abilities or your personality, but rather it's someone's perceptions around how you can improve or a compliment on something that you're already doing. So really do keep that at the forefront of your mind. I know it's very easy to have ideas associated with identities and then when we hear feedback that perhaps is negative or constructive, we quite easily can see that as a judgment statement, but it really isn't. Practice responding versus reacting. So really take a moment for yourself to process the feedback, take a deep breath, burn some sage, meditate, whatever it is that you need to do to ensure that your reaction isn't fueled by emotion, and then also demonstrating emotional intelligence. So I found this great statement where it said reacting is emotional, responding shows emotional intelligence. So really keep that at the forefront when you're in situations where you're receiving feedback, or going into situations where you know you'll be receiving feedback, and really take that time to process that information and reframe your perspective. I think we had a few questions around how can you support your manager in delivering better, more meaningful feedback. So I like to use the term reverse coaching, especially those in authority. So your manager may not always know what's best for you. That's just a matter of fact. So in order for you to get better feedback, you need to lead it. You need to take responsibility for what you can control, and also take responsibility for how you're going to nurture a really positive feedback environment around you. So this is also even more important if you're someone from an underrepresented background, perhaps, and you do want to overcome feedback bias in the workplace, and really ensure that you're honing your skills, and also seeing where you're getting feedback that's focused on your personality versus work done. So no news isn't always good news. So what I like to say about that, really, again, being proactive, you can ask questions such as, I feel like that went pretty well. If you felt like you've done a job well done, did you get the same impression? Getting feedback in that manner. What should I continue doing? Asking your manager questions such as that. What should I stop doing? Where should I prioritize? Also asking for time to process feedback. If you feel like you don't want to react and you instead want to respond, asking for time to process feedback is absolutely fine. And then coming back more collected with some of your thoughts and your questions, and then perhaps a follow-up meeting. Also ensuring that good work isn't always enough for you to get the recognition that you need and to get the feedback that you need in order to progress. So your perception around your good work has to align with your managers, and you have to ensure that you're advocating for yourself, documenting progress, ensuring that you're aligned with your manager and your KPIs, your benchmarks, your goals. And a really great trick is to ensure that your goals and your progression is aligned with your manager's own priorities, because you make them look good, you make yourself look good. So there is a way to progress your career and deliver value, and to ensure that your expectations are in alignment with your manager's goals or objectives for the year, short term and long term. Also looking at understanding your feedback needs. So I think this leads to really understanding what you need to progress in your career, whether that is more specific feedback, making that known, whether there are any core goals that you need to work towards and track against. So for me, that was, I let my manager know that I wanted to be promoted, and that I wanted to get my first promotion. And I asked her, what do I need to do in order to get to that next level? And also we set goals together in order for me to progress and track performance as it relates to those goals. So whenever we had our check-in meetings, it wasn't always talking about promotion. We were making sure that we were optimizing for performance, but in me performing at a specific level, I was able to get that recognition that I needed. So really just assessing yourself, your personality, what sort of feedback do you need? How do you like it? Is it having a spreadsheet? Is it having a document? Is it having check-ins? Being really clear on those feedback needs and sharing that with your manager. Next slide. So before I go on to discussing kind of feedback through the lens of creativity and feedback through the lens of personal branding, are there any questions? I see all comments as well. I see Kenyeda. Please let me know if I mispronounced your name. I'm a little amused because the guy in this pic is looking at the stocks, and I'm also keeping an eye on mine. Yes, I was actually thinking that when I added this stock image, I was like, maybe I should have like, but I don't know, stocks can also be feedback. It's a bit of a stretch, but yeah, how the market is responding that can be considered feedback. So yeah, let's make that a stretch. Any other comments or questions around kind of how you can overcome some of those psychological, social, and cultural barriers? Okay, great. So applying feedback to enhance creativity. So actually for the rest of this workshop, it's going to be quite exercise focused. So these aren't exactly exercises that we need to do in this session, but these are exercises that you can take away and apply to your own work in order to kind of increase your productivity and enhance some of your attributes, especially as it relates to creativity and personal branding. So I love Erykah Badu. I love neo soul music. So I found this really interesting quote from her where she says, "Now keep in mind that I'm an artist and I'm sensitive about my..." So the reason why I bring this up is because when you're thinking about creativity, creativity can be very subjective. I think it can be easy to feel sensitive when you're formulating creative ideas. And I think sometimes it can be difficult to detach creative ideas from your sense of self. But just to remind you, you are not your ideas. And someone who critiques your ideas or provides their perspective, that is not an attack against you, but can actually fuel creative thinking. So the next exercise actually demonstrates something that you can do to fuel creativity in your teams and to drive greater creativity and feedback for your projects. So the exercise is actually called I Like, I Wish. It's an exercise from Satu Rekonen of the Auto Design Factory. So please feel free to screenshot this. It's a really incredible exercise to drive creativity in your teams. And in terms of what it is, I Like, I Wish is a facilitated team feedback activity where members of a team engage in a creative project and get to provide and receive both positive and constructive feedback. And the format, as mentioned, was designed by Satu of the Auto Design Factory. So I'll just give it a minute for you to screenshot this. And then I'll go on to the next slide to explain how it works. Okay, great. So I'll go on to the next slide. So the way that I Like, I Wish exercise works. So step one, you choose a topic or project for feedback. Step two, you write I like, I wish, and I wonder. Step three, you allow each participant, so this exercise needs to be done in a group, groups of around 5 to 10. So you allow each participant in your team 3 to 5 minutes to fill out 1 point for each heading. So they could say, I like this about the project. I wish this project included this, or I wish that this project was presented this way, or this project had this attribute, and I wonder if. And they essentially write those points under those 3 headings. You can either do this verbally or you can do this as a written exercise. And then step 4, whoever is receiving the feedback, so only those that receive the feedback, essentially say thank you, and no conversation or further explanation is needed back to the feedbacker. And then as the person receiving the feedback, you actually synthesize these comments around this constructive feedback that you're receiving from the team, and you leverage those ideas in order to develop your product, your service, your project even further. And it's a great way to create, I don't like to use the term safe space, but create a welcoming space for people to deliver feedback on your project ideas and really drive more creative thinking. I've done this with my team recently, and we had some great ideas for a global framework that we're launching. And it really just sparked some kind of new innovations in our team. So just wanted to share that with you all. So feel free to screenshot this and take this back to your workplaces, or even outside of work. If you're an entrepreneur, your teams, your mentors, you can really use this as an exercise with your projects. And then I will go on to the next section. Has everyone had a chance to screenshot this? Do you need me to go back at all? Just let me know. Okay, great. And applying feedback to enhance personal branding. So the next section, we're just going to cover some exercises that can allow you to really build a clear and concise and reflective personal brand that also is aligned with the perceptions those around you have of you, as well as the perceptions that you have of yourself. So Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon, of course, he said, your brand is what other people say about you when you're not in the room. Some of you may have seen this quote. I think it's a really great summation of what your brand is. And I guess the act of personal branding is being intentional about, I guess, controlling the narrative around how you're perceived and ensuring that aligns with your values, your characteristics, and what you want to be known for. So as it relates to feedback and building your personal brand, again, I'll leave this up for you to screenshot. This is really a feedback exercise that I actually got from taking part in the Black British Business Awards Accelerator program, which has been career changing. I would say I actually would say that program was one of the reasons why I was able to get my first promotion. But this exercise provides the opportunity for you to seek feedback from others and also identify, understand, and harness your strengths to inform your personal brand and also your perception of yourself. I think sometimes we can really get in our heads and perhaps don't necessarily always have the clearest idea of how we're perceived and what our strengths are. So this is a really great exercise for you to get clear on those things. So I'll leave this up. And then I'll pass on to the next section, which talks about how this exercise works. So step one, this is perhaps the scariest part. You actually request feedback from those closest to you, and you ask them to detail their thoughts about your strengths with clear examples of when you have demonstrated these. You then categorize these examples to make sense of the feedback that you collect and identify any common themes or characteristics as it relates to that feedback. Step three is you write a couple of short paragraphs summarizing your best self based on the characteristics, examples, and reflections that you have gathered. And then these statements have to start with, at my best, I, and then you follow up with, at my best, I am XXX, at my best, I am XXX. And then you'll start to build kind of a personal profile in terms of your strengths, how you're perceived. And then you can really look at this, if this reflects or aligns with how you perceive yourself, and then start to make some tweaks to your personal brand if needed, or lean into those strengths in order to kind of really solidify your personal brand. So I'll leave this up just for a couple more minutes and then part onto the next slide, which shows how you can bucket some of these feedback characteristics. Okay, so in terms of how you can take that feedback and start to take that and put it into columns. So column one will be focused on the characteristics. So it could be a statement like, Andrew is a really great collaborator, for instance. So collaboration would be my characteristic. And then that would be followed up by an example. So Andrew is a great collaborator. He has demonstrated this through XXX. And then column three will be the reflection. So you'll start to build a list of your characteristics, your examples, and then also your reflections and whether you how you interpret that information. And then you can really start to see if there are any common themes. I like to kind of create a tally and start to see, oh, collaboration comes up 5 times. And I asked like 11 people. So that's clearly a very strong characteristic that I have. And I've got these tangible examples. This can also help with interview prep. It can help with your LinkedIn profile. So I've taken these characteristics and weaved them into my bio. Any kind of personal biography that you have, this is really a great tool. And also on days that you feel like you've got imposter syndrome, like I get those days a lot. I look back on this note that I wrote to myself, which starts again with, at my best I, and then I'm able to have that affirmation and that validation, that evidence for the things that I've been able to achieve. So on those days where I'm feeling like, why am I here? Why did they select me? Like, I've been like an imposter. I'm really able to go back to that note and be like, oh, okay, you actually have evidence of the fact that you can do this. So I definitely recommend this exercise. And I've got my notes stored on my laptop. I was going to read it, but it's like super long, so I probably won't. But this is a really great exercise. So that actually brings us to the end of this workshop. So in terms of summary of key takeaways, we defined what feedback was. We defined what feedback is not and how it's different from advice and from praise. We discussed why feedback matters. We shared the benefits of feedback. We assessed why feedback can be difficult. So what are the psychological, social, and cultural reasons? We delved into ways you can overcome these barriers to effective feedback. And then we shared exercises to nurture creativity and uncover your personal brand. So any final questions, comments, thoughts?
Hi everyone, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask Andrew questions. I believe this would be a Q&A. Yeah, Andrew, you're welcome to answer any questions.
Oh, I see. Is there any way we can share the slides? I won't be able to share the slides, but I can share a condensed version, which includes the exercises and some of the key points. So I can share that perhaps with the BLIX team, and then you can share that with all of the attendees.
Yeah, awesome. We have this content.
Oh, and it's recorded. Yeah.
Yes, BLIX Byte, and we record the session as well. So if you go back to our website there, you would have the content from today's workshop on the website. So that's blix.network.
Yeah. Any other questions? This can be about the topic. It can be about anything. I think we've got like about 15 to 20 minutes. And also, thanks so much for joining me for this kind of lengthy session. I know many of you may be at work, so I really appreciate it.
I'm going to ask, have you been in a situation where you got a bad feedback? Because we define what feedback is and what feedback is not. And how did you respond? Because I know one of the content from the slide said, practice how to respond, not to react. So have you been in a situation like that? And what are the things that we can do in order to respond instead of being reactive or being defensive?
Yeah, great question, Edema. I think I've definitely received bad feedback for sure, like more times than I can count. I think being conscious of that negative self-talk that arises when you get that feedback. So sometimes that could look like, who are you to tell me that? Or this person clearly perhaps doesn't have a great, I'm not in good standing with this person, or perhaps there's just lots of different themes that can run around in our head when we receive bad feedback, especially I think when bad feedback is also followed up with advice, but you may not necessarily want to, you're not open to receiving advice from that person. I think really being conscious of that negative self-talk, writing it down when it arises, because I think you can't slay a monster if you don't know what it looks like. So I think really understanding, what is that negative self-talk? Where is that coming from? How can I be rewrite the narrative? So if it's, say, a case of someone, I say that this person perhaps doesn't have as much experience or doesn't have a standing to provide me with that feedback, actually reframing that and thinking about the new perspective that they are bringing to the work that I'm doing, that really helps me be open to feedback in the future. I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but I think it's really important first for us to acknowledge and understand any reactions. Like, what are the first things that you say to yourself when that person gives you feedback? And is it a pattern with that one person, or is it a pattern with different people as it relates to me receiving feedback? Does that answer your question? Or
yeah, it does. I like the part where you say perspective, because sometimes there is what somebody says to you, and then there's a meaning where you sort of translate person says as well. So you're right, it's reframing it in the mind. And sometimes with negative or with bad feedback, you don't have that few seconds to reframe your thinking process. So
Yeah.
like more practice and stuff. Yeah. That answered my question.
And I think even I mentioned earlier on how you can just say, can I have some time to process that feedback and get back to you? So if you need to excuse yourself from the situation, reflect and come back with a resolution, I'd always encourage that too. Yeah.
There's a question here from Tessie. I think she says, please, can you share your thoughts on feedback and building anti-racist cultures? So follow-up comment is anti-racist, encouraging a psychologically safe environment where inclusion is truly lived.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I know anti-racism work, there are definitely professionals that could speak at more depth about anti-racism work than certainly I could. Of course, I have my own experiences being a Black man in the workplace. I think with anti-racist work, there needs to definitely be an acknowledgement for how feedback across difference, how white managers providing feedback to Black employees, how psychologically that is impacted with positive feedback bias. And I think not enough people understand that, understand the studies around feedback across difference, and how that impacts the ability for underrepresented, especially racially underrepresented employees to really take tangible feedback from their managers and have that feedback focus on the work versus that feedback focus on them as a person. Because I think if you start to look at feedback on personality traits, that can be riddled with stereotype threats or perceptions, which you can get into really murky waters. So I think it's important that feedback has to be objective, and you have to tie that to measurable outcomes, whether that be KPIs, data, metrics, clear objectives that are as objective as possible versus entering into the murky waters. So I think there needs to be wider education with those dominant folks within the workplace, and by dominant I mean those who are the majority, whether that be whether you're in a male-dominated environment, whether it's an environment that's predominantly perhaps a certain racial group. So I think trying to make things as objective as possible, and I know that that is easier said than done because we are very relationship-oriented individuals. We tend to be attracted to people who are like us or have similar backgrounds. But I think raising education around how feedback across difference impacts meaningful feedback is really important, especially amongst management.
Yeah, I really like your response about objectivity, because then there are results and then performance where you can focus on. So it doesn't feel like you're speaking about me as a person in terms of my behavior, but you're looking at my results. Then I can see, okay, we're talking about the results and not me as an individual, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't feel like it's like you're invading my space or my person. That's just, it's not,
Yeah, 100%. Like you can't really argue with the facts, or they call them the receipts, right? Performance speaks for itself. And I think it also it hinders the ability to receive feedback as well. Like I know stereotype threat and just knowing about stereotypes in the workplace can hinder my ability to receive feedback. So also educating people who are from minority groups around like what are the psychological things that you need to look out for when receiving feedback, and ensuring that you're as open as possible while still protecting yourself too, because of course that experience is valid. So it's really finding that balance.
Also, do you think that emotional intelligence as well plays a key role in terms of like the way feedback is being delivered? Because and do you think that managers who give feedback, right, should go through some kind of emotional intelligence training or workshop, in order to be able to deliver effective feedback?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a lot more done around mindset training and emotional intelligence in the workplace. I don't think that there is nowhere near enough. I actually go to therapy, which is really helpful in terms of unpacking some of kind of my perhaps habits that aren't as as positive as they should be, or unlearning some of the things that that aren't conducive to my progress. And I think, obviously, I know therapy isn't always accessible to absolutely everyone, but there are some great organizations out there. But I definitely think emotional intelligence training, there are some great consultant firms out there that can work with managers to really unpack this. But then and even the Black British Business Awards, they do some great work through their Talent Accelerator program in terms of backing up their strategies with research around like feedback across difference, why this matters to managers, and how they can overcome some of those barriers to more effective feedback, and ensuring that everyone advances in a way that's equitable.
Yeah, because sometimes feedback can be very emotional and intense. No matter how much you feel like you're very structured in your approach, things can just go sideways, so.
Yes, yeah. And I think that formula really helps as well on one of the earlier slides in terms of breaking down the actual structure of what good feedback looks like, and the fact that it isn't the same as advice, because sometimes advice can be littered with bias a lot more than feedback is when it's open to someone to come up with their own solutions.
I'm gonna ask a follow-up question, but there's a question here from Jasper saying, are there studies done on the optimal feedback cycle, like weekly, daily, monthly, yearly, etc., connecting to one of the earlier studies findings?
Yes, so I think it was the study around Gen Z that I came across on Inc.com that talked about the need for there to be more regular check-ins, daily check-ins. There was also a study. Yes. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just connecting to the one quote about the Gen Z, like 40% saying they would like daily checkups. I was wondering whether there's like a study that has like the best practice of how regular that should be, because daily seemed a bit excessive, but then also at the end of a project always seems like there's a lot of time where you don't receive any feedback and you don't have room to improve. So I was wondering whether you have any insights on that.
Yeah, I think it also depends on how you define feedback as well. I think all of us experience some form of feedback on a daily basis. And I think it's about understanding the scale at which you want to deliver the feedback, and then also the cadence of the feedback. Like for instance, if you create a culture of feedback, then you're likely to get that on a daily basis. So I think it's looking at, I think to my earlier slide, there were different forms of feedback. Perhaps for the more structured forms of feedback, what is the optimal cadence for those? I think starting there would be great, and then looking at how you can nurture and foster a culture that enables fast feedback on the daily, so that your teams can be agile, ensure that they're listened to and their work is valued. But yeah, that's my 2 cents. I'm sure there are more studies out there around that, but yeah, hopefully that helps.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I also think it depends on the relationship again with your manager, because sometimes managers provide on-the-spot feedback. Some people call that spot. So maybe they probably observed something that you did and felt, oh, maybe I could just say this on the spot rather than wait till 3 months time.
Annual review.
Project, and by that time you sort of forget what you actually saw in the person, and then you start making stories. So yeah, I think on the spot feedback is also really good. And I know you did touch a bit on advice. That advice sometimes can be misguided or something, or mistook. I'm not sure the word. I don't want to misquote you. Yeah, unsolicited. Yeah. So do you, in terms of potential, because I believe as a manager or as a leader of a team, you are not only do you lead the team to deliver results, I believe you also should be able to manage the potential of your team, know how to construct this to extract the potential of your team, right? So they could be better, so they could, progress, in their career. Do you think feedback helps, right? Do you think feedback helps to highlight the potential of a team member as to saying, oh, take this advice, do it this way, do it that way?
Yeah, I let me relay the question. So this is what I heard So do you think feedback is sufficient to unlock the potential of your teams? And then what is the place of advice as a manager in unlocking potential of your teams? Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks for reframing that.
No, that was very clear. I think that with feedback, what is so powerful about feedback is that it allows people to come to their own solutions by themselves. And I think when they learn those things for themselves, the message is likely to stick a lot longer than, say, someone just prescribes what they should do. I don't know if you've had experiences whereby you've come to where you've been nurtured or mentored to discover something for yourself that has likely lasted much longer than someone just telling you that you should do something. I also think the challenge with advice is, although it typically comes from someone who's more experienced, I think you have a challenge with conformity. If someone is constantly advising you on how to do something, you lack the ability to find creative solutions to do the same thing, but perhaps with a different approach and with a different personality style or a different way of working. So I think advice has the challenge of resulting in conformity. I do think advice has its place, especially when someone is perhaps more junior or requesting advice as well. If someone actually is asking you for advice, I do think has its place. Or if feedback is misunderstood. So feedback may be misunderstood, and then that person may go off and do something that perhaps wasn't your initial intention. So I think it definitely has its place. But I would say feedback as a tool to nurture your teams is perhaps more valuable because, again, it leads to individuality. The lessons are likely to stick for a lot longer, and it allows people to arrive at their own solutions by themselves. Yeah. I see someone.
Yeah.
I see Liddell. Would you always say feedback should be written? I think it depends. Answer with it depends is so funny because you're like literally like not really. But I think it depends on if it's like structured formal feedback. I think it helps to document that. But I think it depends on how best that person likes to receive feedback as well. But I definitely think unstructured and informal feedback tends to kind of be a bit more aloof, like it can be a chat or ad hoc or yeah. So I think structured feedback definitely needs to be documented. I wouldn't say always written as well, because I think you have to think about different people's like learning styles and also different people's impairments. Like someone could be visually impaired, etc. Like I think there's different ways that people can take in information, but I think it should at least be documented. And the way that is documented is depending on the person receiving the feedback, the organizational structures, processes, etc. Kenyetta, how do you get feedback out of a manager that does not or cannot find time to get it? Oof. I think your manager should always find time to give feedback. I think it's a core responsibility for them. It's a benefit for them as well in giving you feedback, because it means that you're more than likely to deliver on what's important to them. I think the chances are, if your manager is, this would be a weird situation, but I think it could not be a weird situation. I think if your manager doesn't find time to give you feedback, then it means that you may not be a priority, or the project that you're coming to them with may not be a priority for them. So you actually have to ask yourself, is the work that I'm doing a priority for the team and a priority for my manager? If not, then you should probably drop it. Or if they're just generally discarding you, then that's a HR issue, and you need to call like Sally from HR or something to, well, not Sally from HR, but you need to call HR to sort that. So yeah, that's my 2 cents there.
So just to touch back on your presentation earlier on, you did mention being proactive about feedback. Just to double up the question from Kenyatta, yeah. do you think that you can be proactive in that situation to say, okay, I'm going to have a couple of questions about my performance to approach the manager, to get his or her opinion, right, informally, right, and see if it, see the way he or she responds, to the questions, and then maybe throw an idea and say, maybe we should do this a lot more often, Do you think, would it be stretching it,
Yeah, no, I definitely think you should be proactive about it. My understanding of the question was if you're proactive and they still don't have time to actually engage your feedback. So that was my interpretation, which perhaps may be wrong. But I definitely think like one-to-ones, I think are the bedrock of any relationship which you have with your manager, and ensuring that you have regular one-to-one cadence outside of any team meetings. Really ensuring that you're setting an agenda beforehand and documenting notes from your one-to-ones. I think that should really be kind of the space in which you're able to seek that feedback and be proactive about that feedback. But yeah, hopefully that answers the question. And yeah. Okay, cool. Any other questions? Oh, we're actually at time. Thank you, Lena. Thank you so much, everyone. I'll just do the next slide, which is essentially my contact details. So thank you all so much for joining the session. This is my first workshop that I've done in like forever. So it's really been a pleasure to have some time with you all. Hope this was valuable. Please take these lessons, apply them to your career. I want to share all this goodness because clearly, like, I'm an example. I was able to get to make some strides in my own career, and I really hope that you are too. Here's my Instagram. I realized I put Instagram, but that's really bad. I work at Facebook, that's very wrong, but hey ho. Here's my email address. Here's my LinkedIn profile. Please connect, and wish you all the best. Have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all the learnings from today. And thank you everyone for joining us. This would be our last workshop for this summer. And I'm so happy that we ended it this way. Really loved the learning, loved the presentation. I'm going to say a very big shout out and thank you to all the BLIX mentors and the BLIX team for putting in the hard work, hosting the workshop, facilitating the workshop, and to everyone who've attended the workshop. We wouldn't run the workshops if we don't have people attending it. So thank you so much, guys. Thank you so very much. And I hope you have a lovely summer.